What kind of relationship did you two have? We were just very, very close spiritually ourselves. How did he reach out to you in the first place? He came and found me in a crazy way, Chaka Khan recalls. In your hometown? No. In San Francisco, actually. From the outside, it looked like a casual story between two legends. But the way Chaka tells it, the connection between her and Prince was never just professional. It was spiritual, something that went far beyond music charts and sold-out arenas. Years later, after Prince turned his back on the church, the people who had known him best began to notice things they could not explain away as eccentricity. These weren't random rumors. They were patterns. His closest friends say that his personality shifted almost overnight. The man who once glowed with mischief and fearless confidence became withdrawn, suspicious, and physically fragile. He locked himself away for long stretches of time. Whispers followed him about sudden collapses, panicked calls, and quiet emergencies that never made the tabloids. According to Chaka Khan, Prince didn't simply walk away from religion. He stepped into a spiritual no-man's land, a place where guilt, fear, and pain circled him relentlessly with no clear path back to peace. Relationships fell apart. His body began to fail. Even though he had avoided modern medicine for years, he grew dangerously dependent on prescription painkillers. People who loved him started asking a question that no one wanted recorded on camera. Was Prince being punished? Or was he slowly destroying himself after cutting loose from the only spiritual anchor he had ever known? Chaka Khan would later suggest that what Prince endured in those years was not freedom at all. It was torment so deep she believed it was worse than death. This file traces the dark chain of events that followed Prince's break with the church, and why some people believe the price he paid was never meant to be survivable. Chapter 1: Prince, the Church, and the Conflict 1960s-1980s. Prince Rogers Nelson was born into sound and into contradiction. In Minneapolis, his childhood world was built from two clashing elements, music and faith. Church was close, both as a physical space and as a language. He heard gospel harmonies, sermons about judgment and mercy, and strict moral boundaries long before he understood the meanings behind them. But inside his own home, stability was fragile. His parents' relationship was turbulent. Arguments, separations, and emotional distance taught him that devotion and chaos could occupy the same room. That tension never really left him. It turned into fuel. From a young age, Prince seemed to have a restless inner life. He was disciplined, intensely private, and painfully sensitive to being judged. Music gave him the one thing reality did not control. He could build entire worlds from soundbend rules and rewrite stories in real time. Faith, especially organized faith, did the opposite. It offered rules that felt immovable. Even as a teenager, Prince was being pulled in three directions at once: belief, desire, and freedom. He wanted God. He wanted sex. He wanted to create without needing anyone's permission. Trying to reconcile those forces didn't just influence his life. It became the blueprint for it. When he broke into the mainstream in the late 1970s and then detonated across the world in the 1980s, that private struggle turned into a public spectacle. Albums like Dirty Mind 1999 and Purple Rain didn't just hint at sexuality. They scented it. Prince sang openly about lust, pleasure, and temptation with a bluntness that made conservative America flinch. On stage, he blurred gender lines, shredded modesty, and refused to apologize. For countless fans, especially young black listeners, it felt like liberation. A black man owning his body, his desire, and his weirdness without begging for approval. But for others, particularly inside conservative churches, it felt like an assault. By the mid-1980s, Prince wasn't just a pop star. He had turned into a symbol, and symbols invite judgment. Pastors preached entire sermons with his lyrics as Exhibit A. Religious commentators used his videos as proof that black music had lost its way. Talk radio callers and newspaper columnists described him as a corrupter, a dangerous influence dragging young people away from God. The phrase moral decay started following his name around. What made it uniquely painful was that Prince never saw himself as an enemy of God. According to people who knew him, including Chaka Khan, he believed deeply in a higher power. He prayed. He searched. He wrestled. The problem was not disbelief. The problem was guilt. Chaka has said that, even in those early years, Prince carried a quiet sense of moral conflict. He loved the church's language of grace, but he could not silence his desires. And the louder the condemnation became, the deeper that conflict cut into him. His music from this era is full of that tension. Explicit sexuality sits side by side with religious imagery, angels' judgment, heaven's sin, salvation. Songs swing between warning and invitation, ecstasy and fear. He wasn't mocking faith. He was circling it, arguing with it, demanding that it respond. To some listeners that sounded like blasphemy. To others it sounded like confession. But institutions aren't built for confession. They're built to enforce lines. As Prince's fame expanded, so did the scrutiny. His videos were investigated for indecency. Parents' groups campaigned against him. He was lumped together with other artists supposedly corrupting the youth. Soon the criticism shifted from his work to his character. Writers and preachers accused him of enjoying sin without consequence, of reveling in temptation he would never pay for. That accusation mattered because Prince heard it. Those close to him describe a man who absorbed judgment like a sponge. He didn't shrug it off as ignorance. He internalized it. Chaka Khan later said Prince was always aware of how he was viewed by the church. He wasn't rebelling against God, he was terrified of disappointing him. That fear hardened into a chronic underground guilt, quiet, constant, unresolved. By the late 1980s, Prince was at the absolute height of his creative power, but the conflict inside him was intensifying. Success didn't quiet the accusations. It amplified them. The more visible he became, the more he was held up as an example of excess, of temptation, of what not to become. For a black artist raised in and around church culture, that kind of spiritual judgment carried extra weight. The church wasn't just an institution. It was community, family, identity. And Prince felt himself drifting away from it. His estrangement did not look like teenage rebellion. It looked like exhaustion. Interviews from that time show a man more guarded, sidestepping questions about religion, refusing to be trapped in the role of either saint or villain. His answers grew shorter, more elusive, as if he were protecting something fragile inside himself. But the pressure never let up. By the end of the decade, Prince stood between two demanding forces. The church wanted repentance. The music industry wanted provocation. He tried to satisfy neither, and ended up satisfying no one, including himself. This is where the conflict stopped being an abstract theme and started becoming dangerous. Chaka Khan would later describe this period with terrifying clarity. Prince, she said, wasn't rejecting God. He was wrestling with guilt, the belief that his desires made him unworthy, that his creativity itself might be sinful, that he could only be one of two things, holy or damned. That fight did not close with the 1980s. It escalated. The conditions were set for a break that would change everything. Prince wasn't done with God, but guilt left unresolved always comes back, demanding payment. Turning against the church. Prince never held a press conference to declare war on the church. There was no open letter, no dramatic sermon. His break came in fragments, missed meetings, quiet refusals, doors that stopped opening. By the early 1990s, people who knew him well began to notice the pattern. His relationship with organized religion wasn't strained anymore. It was hostile. The guilt that had once driven him toward the altar was now driving him away from it. Friends and collaborators from that era say Prince started speaking openly in private about how religious authority had shaped his shame. He questioned why desire was automatically labeled sin, why his art was treated like a moral problem, why faith seemed to ask for submission instead of understanding. To him, Church no longer felt like shelter. It felt like surveillance. He believed that religious systems, especially those surrounding black communities, relied on fear of hell, fear of being cast out, fear of losing family and community if you stepped out of line. And he saw that fear following him everywhere, in interviews, in reviews, in fan conversations, where strangers felt entitled to evaluate his soul. For the first time, he refused to participate. He began openly rejecting any form of moral oversight. He wouldn't sanitize lyrics or imagery to appease religious critics. He bristled when interviewers tried to pin his songs to neat spiritual narratives. In private, he reportedly called the church an institution that confused control with holiness. That choice didn't bring him peace. It made him a target. Religious fans who once defended him as complicated but still faithful started to pull away. Some labeled him arrogant. Others insisted he had turned his back on God completely. The same communities that once claimed him now used him as a cautionary tale. The tone shifted from concern to condemnation. Prince noticed every inch of that change. Friendships cooled. People he'd known for years approached him with a new stiffness, as if waiting for him to repent. Invitations dropped off. Calls went unanswered on both sides. Inside his own mind, something hardened. Those around him say he began keeping mental lists, who could be trusted, who could not. It wasn't delusion. It was disappointment. He felt watched, not loved. Professionally, his need for control spread across everything. Collaborations stalled or dissolved without explanation. Studio sessions grew more closed off. People who once wandered in and out of Paisley Park found themselves shut out. Where he used to feed off creative exchange, he now preferred total command. Friends described him as withdrawn and guarded yet restless. He wasn't trying to balance faith and desire anymore. He was trying to outrun the shame that faith had embedded into him. But running from something and resolving it are not the same. As he stepped away from the church, the freedom he imagined never arrived. Instead, he found himself alone with unanswered questions about morality, forgiveness, and whether he had crossed some invisible boundary he could never return from. The church had at least offered a framework, however painful. Without it, there were no rules, but there was also no absolution. Those close to him say he began seeing judgment even when none was spoken. He analyzed motives. He reread conversations. He braced for criticism that sometimes never came. Defensiveness became a reflex. People he once confided in were held at arm's length. In trying to escape the cage of religious judgment, Prince had built another cage, this one made of mistrust. At the same time, personal strain intensified. Romantic relationships became more volatile. Commitment felt like a trap. Vulnerability felt like a risk he could not afford. According to those who watched him up close, he longed for unconditional acceptance, but had been trained to expect the opposite. By the mid-1990s industry, insiders began whispering about a change that went beyond fashion or sound. Something in Prince's energy was different. He was still brilliant, but more rigid, less playful, slower to laugh. In those conversations, the word curse started appearing not as superstition but as shorthand. People didn't mean literal demons. They meant consequences. They saw a man who had severed a painful spiritual bond without finding anything to replace it. Chaka Khan would later frame it, simply this was the moment Prince stopped fighting the church and started fighting himself. He shut down religious questions in interviews. Faith became a subject he would not touch. When pressed, he deflected. The topic wasn't healed. It was sealed. Underneath, the tension between refusal and regret simmered on. Prince had broken free from external religious control, but he had lost the only structure that once gave his guilt somewhere to go. With nothing left to absorb it, that guilt turned inward. What followed: failed relationships, mounting pain, dependence on pills, and a death that shocked the world didn't feel like a lightning strike. It felt like a slow, relentless collection of unpaid spiritual debts. The curse begins: scandals and private collapse, late 1990, 2007. By the late 1990s, the shift around Prince was no longer just spiritual. It could be felt in the room before he even spoke. People who worked with him during this period said the atmosphere changed. There was less laughter, more rules. Longer silences. The man who once thrived on intimacy jokes and spontaneous jam sessions started moving through his own home like someone guarding a sensitive perimeter. The first cracks showed up in his private life. His marriage began to strain under pressures that never fully showed up in public. Friends recalled arguments about boundaries, control, and trust, arguments that ended without resolution and left the air heavy. When the relationship finally collapsed, it did so quietly. There were no screaming tabloid headlines, no messy public divorce spectacle. But those close to Prince said the fallout was devastating. He pulled back even further, as if every failed bond proved his fear that being fully known meant being judged or abandoned. Around the same time, whispers started about secret relationships. These weren't splashy affairs designed for gossip sites. They were whispered in studio corners and back offices, brief connections, intense attachments, then abrupt disappearances. People who watched this pattern unfold described a man searching for comfort while afraid of exposure. He wanted closeness without scrutiny, love without having to hand over his vulnerabilities. That combination simply doesn't exist. As relationships fell apart, his need for control deepened. According to several insiders, Prince tightened everything: access to him, access to Paisley Park, even the language people were allowed to use around him. Guests described the compound as highly controlled spontaneity, gone doors kept, closed cameras, restricted conversations watched. Some collaborators stopped coming by. Others were quietly phased out. It didn't look like a power trip. It looked like fear disguised as order. Then came the event that shattered any fragile balance that remained. In October 1996, Prince and his wife lost their newborn son to a rare genetic condition. Publicly, the world barely heard about it. Privately, it was a detonation. Friends said that the grief altered him in a way nothing else had. He didn't process it out loud. He imploded. According to people who spoke with him, Prince began circling one idea over and over: payment. He wondered if this loss was punishment. If his earlier choices, his explicit music, his resistance to religious authority, his break from the church, were now being repaid in the cruelest way possible. He searched for meaning in the tragedy and found answers that only deepened his guilt. This is where, according to some of his closest confidants, the word curse quietly surfaced. Not as superstition, but as metaphor. They didn't mean literal hexes. They meant a life that suddenly looked like a chain of consequences stretching backward: unresolved shame, spiritual estrangement, and now an unthinkable loss. Those who heard him talk about it said he didn't describe demons. He described judgment. From God. From himself. In his mind, the death of his son became evidence that he had crossed some invisible boundary. Something he had done or refused to repent for now seemed to demand a price. From that point on, his behavior shifted again. Prince grew stricter with himself, but it didn't bring peace. He swung between periods of rigid self-control and moments of emotional collapse. Some days he seemed calm, almost peaceful. Other days he was brittle and unreachable, as if a single question might shatter him. Professionally, he kept working prolifically. But those who were in the studio with him said the music felt heavier. Lyrics circled judgment, redemption, loneliness. Studio sessions stretched late into the night, repeated endlessly, as if silence was more dangerous to him than exhaustion. Behind closed doors, another enemy was growing: pain. Prince started complaining about chronic physical pain: his hips, his legs, his lower body. At first he dismissed it, publicly consistent with his long-standing distrust of modern medicine. Privately, his inner circle saw the truth. The pain wasn't occasional. It was constant. According to those around him, the contradiction became brutal. He did not believe in submitting his body to major surgery. He didn't want long-term medical oversight. But he could no longer function physically or artistically without relief. That was the opening through which prescription pain medication entered his life. Not with a dramatic overdose or wild party, but quietly in doses justified as temporary managed necessary. At first, medication was a tool, something to get him through a rehearsal, a performance, a sleepless night. But chronic pain never stopped asking for more. As the 2000s began, people close to Prince noticed the shift's sharp fluctuations in energy, long stretches of hyperfocus followed by days of withdrawal. Mood swings that looked less like ego and more like someone living at the intersection of physical torment and spiritual panic. All the while, scandals stayed out of the headlines. That secrecy was intentional. Prince's team worked overtime to contain stories, redirect narratives, and maintain a myth of total self-control. The industry helped protect that image. According to Chaka Khan, during this period, Prince started talking less like a man planning his future and more like a man serving a sentence. He spoke about enduring rather than living, surviving rather than thriving. The curse, if people called it, that wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a slow-motion collapse, grief, shame, isolation, and pain, all feeding on each other behind locked doors. He didn't believe he was haunted. He believed he was accountable for his art, for defying religious expectations, for walking away from the church, for not going back. That belief reshaped every choice he made next. Pain, Faith, and Medication, 2016. By the early 2000s, Prince's main opponent was no longer controversy. It was his own body. People who worked with him during these years remember the details clearly. The way he moved more slowly, carefully, testing how much weight his hips could carry. The way he sat down between songs when no cameras were around. Rehearsals that used to run for hours now, broken into smaller segments. Under the spotlight, he pushed through, still the consummate performer. When the lights went down, the pain was obvious. Prince's chronic pain, especially in his hips and lower body, became a constant factor in his life. Those close to him have described it as relentless. Sharp when he moved. Dull but persistent when he rested. Always there. Yet even as the pain worsened, his distrust of modern medicine remained. According to people familiar with his beliefs, Prince saw surgery as a last resort, almost a violation of the body he believed God had given him. He associated invasive treatment with defeat, dependency on drugs, or doctors felt to him like spiritual failure. Faith and discipline, he believed, should be enough. Pain did not agree. Touring schedules and the physical demands of performance forced a choice he had spent years avoiding. He could not go on stage in that condition without help. He didn't want surgery. He didn't want to become a patient. But he also couldn't bear the pain raw. Prescription painkillers became the compromise. At first they were introduced carefully. Limited doses, managed through intermediaries. He framed them as a tool, something he could set aside once his body adjusted or when the schedule eased up. But chronic pain rarely lets go. By the late 2000s, witnesses say his mobility had significantly declined. Climbing stairs became difficult. Standing still for long periods was a challenge. Even walking required small, deliberate adjustments. Still, he tried to avoid full surgical intervention for as long as possible. His fear of surrendering control over his body was that deep. As the physical strain increased, so did the medication. Those around him noticed changes in energy and focus. Some days he seemed electrified, working, recording, rehearsing endlessly. Other days he was remote, hovering at the edge of conversations. Dependency crept in, not wild, obvious addiction, but a slow tightening of the same compromise he had sworn would be temporary. In 2010, reports surfaced that Prince had finally undergone hip surgery. It was a public sign of what those close to him already knew. The pain had become impossible to hide, impossible to push through. Even then, the surgery didn't resolve everything. Recovery was limited, and he returned to performing faster than most doctors would have recommended. The underlying dynamic did not change. He still distrusted long-term medical oversight. He still leaned on medication. As the years went on, Paisley Park transformed fully into a sealed environment. It became both sanctuary and cage a place where he could control everything and a place no one could easily get in to help him. Access narrowed. Calls were filtered. Visitors were screened. People who tried to raise concerns about his health found themselves gently pushed to the edges. To Prince, concern often sounded like criticism, and criticism sounded like judgment. Faith sat at the center of this trap. According to Chaka Khan and others, Prince interpreted his relationship with medication, not just medically, but spiritually. He wondered if relying on pills meant he lacked faith. If pain was a test, he was failing. If easing it meant stepping out of line with what God wanted from him. He didn't see his painkiller use as addiction. He saw it as endurance, a necessary burden he carried to keep playing, to keep creating, to keep living up to the work he believed he was born to do. In April 2016, that fragile balance cracked in public. After a performance in Atlanta, his private plane made an emergency landing in Illinois. Prince was found unresponsive and rushed to a hospital, treated for what officials later described as an incident related to opioids. He was released within hours. Doctors reportedly urged follow-up care, monitoring, structured treatment. But within days he returned to Paisley Park. The fortress closed around him again. The pattern resumed. On April 21, 2016, staff found Prince unresponsive in an elevator inside Paisley Park. Emergency responders tried to revive him, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at 10:07 a.m. The autopsy and toxicology reports later revealed extremely high levels of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid many times stronger than morphine, along with other substances. The dose was not minor. It was catastrophic. The world reacted with shock. This was Prince, the disciplined genius, the man who preached control and precision, the artist who seemed to live above common self-destruction. For those who had watched him struggle, the reports did not feel like a contradiction. They felt like confirmation of what they had feared for years. Prince had been trapped between belief and biology, between a body in constant pain and a spiritual code that made surrender feel like sin. Chaka Khan would later say Prince believed he was paying a price, not in flames or thunder, but in daily suffering. He didn't view himself as reckless. He viewed himself as carrying a cross he couldn't put down. The medication did not cause the tragedy by itself. It exposed the deeper tragedy underneath a man who believed pain was deserved, help was weakness, and relief might be proof of spiritual failure. The so-called curse, if it existed at all, was not supernatural. It was the belief that he had to carry everything alone. Worse than death, isolation, and the final years. By 2014, Prince's world had narrowed to a point that made people around him uneasy. Paisley Park, once buzzing with musicians, dancers, and late-night sessions, had grown quieter. Access was tighter than ever. Even longtime collaborators found it almost impossible to reach him directly. Every interaction had to pass through layers assistant security schedules. Those who did make it inside described a silence that felt deliberate. Prince moved through the building, softly, almost like he was conserving both physical and emotional energy. Conversations were short. Meetings ended quickly. He rarely lingered just to talk. His pain was visible in the way he walked, the way he sat, the way he adjusted his body between songs. So was his isolation. By 2015, his social circle had shrunk to a small handful of people he fully trusted. Even they were kept at a distance emotionally. He attended fewer events, avoided crowded gatherings, and when he did appear in public, it was controlled and brief. Smile, wave, vanish. According to staff, attempts at intervention were scattered and fragile. People sensed danger but didn't know how to break through the walls he had carefully built. Prince had spent years equating concern with judgment. When someone worried about him, he heard criticism, not care. Chaka Khan later said that in those final years, Prince spoke less about music and more about endurance. He talked about making it through, not about what came next. His language wasn't melodramatic. It was resigned, like someone measuring time rather than planning a future. On April 7, 2016, he performed at the Fox Theater in Atlanta. Fans noticed that he seemed frail. His movements were slower, his pauses longer. Still, he finished the show. The next day, his plane made the emergency landing that would become the warning nobody successfully answered. He was treated. He walked out of the hospital. He went home. The pattern resumed. 2 weeks later, he was gone. In the weeks that followed, investigators dug through the reality Prince had kept hidden for so long. The fentanyl levels in his system were not a one-time mistake. They pointed to prolonged exposure to a body that had been right at the edge for a long time. To the public, it was a shocking twist in the story of a man they thought they knew. To people like Chaka Khan, it was confirmation of a spiritual condition she believed he had been living with for years. According to her, what Prince endured toward the end was not simply physical agony. It was spiritual exhaustion. He no longer believed he was truly forgiven by the church, by God, or by himself. That belief, if true, would explain everything: the isolation, the secrecy, the refusal to let people help. When Chaka said it was worse than death, she wasn't talking about his final moments. She was talking about the years before years spent living without grace, without a sense that mercy still applied to him. Prince woke up each day convinced he was still paying for something he could never fully identify or erase. Talent became duty. Discipline turned into self-punishment. Pain became proof that he deserved what he was going through. He wasn't waiting to die. He was trying to endure. This is the point where the idea of a curse becomes sharp. Not as witchcraft or superstition, but as a psychological and spiritual reality. The curse was guilt without absolution, faith without comfort, fame without refuge. Prince had walked away from the institution of the church, but never found a new spiritual framework that allowed him to forgive himself. That left a vacuum where shame grew unchecked. By the end, he trusted almost no one. He carried his injuries, physical and emotional, inside a fortress designed to protect him from scrutiny. The same walls that blocked judgment also blocked rescue. There were no public breakdowns, no viral meltdowns, no last-minute confessions. His collapse happened exactly the way he had lived those final years, quietly behind closed doors, surrounded by music, medicine, and silence. The tragedy is not simply that Prince died. The deeper tragedy is that he died believing that suffering was his role. That enduring pain was the only way to prove something to God, to the world, to himself. If there was a curse, it was this: the price of unresolved faith, the weight of guilt that never found release, the belief that you must hurt to be worthy. Prince did not lose his genius. He lost his spiritual anchor and never allowed anyone or anything to replace it. In the end, we're left with questions that no autopsy can answer. Was Prince truly haunted by some unseen curse after turning against the church? Or was the real danger something far more human, a man left spiritually alone, carrying a lifetime of guilt, with no one he trusted enough to help him lay it down? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the